Every September, I get letters that say almost exactly the same thing. Somebody spent a good, hard weekend in the fall pulling out a plant that had been bothering them for years. They felt terrific about it. And then they watched that same plant come back the following June in 5 places instead of 1. That is not bad luck. That is not bad soil. That is not you being too slow or too soft on the shovel. That is a plant that took your weekend as a deposit. Here is what I have come to believe after a long time paying attention to this, and I want to say it plainly, because it took me far too many seasons to see it. The plants that take over a garden do not do it by growing. Every plant grows. They do it by banking. Underneath each one of these plants is a savings account, and that account is what pays for the comeback. When you dig, when you pull, when you run a tiller through a bed, when you chop a crowded clump in half in October because it looked untidy, you are very often not making a withdrawal at all. You are making a deposit. This is Golden Harvest, and today I have 15 perennials I regret planting. But I am also going to give you something I have never once heard said on a video like this one. I am going to tell you which of them you should rip out before fall, and which of them you must not touch this fall under any circumstances, because pulling those in September is close to the most expensive thing a home gardener can do with a free Saturday. Rip them out before fall is exactly right for the first 6 plants on this list. There is a hard deadline coming, and it is real and it is close. For most of the rest, rip out is the most expensive verb in gardening. Knowing which pile a plant belongs in, that is the whole video. And by the end of it, you will be able to walk into your own beds and sort any aggressive plant you own into the right pile in about 30 seconds. Before we go one step further, do me a favor. Put your hardiness zone in the comments, because at least 3 plants on this list behave like completely different organisms above zone 6 than they do below it. And I read those comments to work out what this community actually needs. Drop the number. Then stay with me, because plant number 15 is the one that has ended up in property line arguments between neighbors who got along perfectly well beforehand. Let me hand you the model first, because once you have it, these 15 plants stop being a list to memorize and turn into a set of worked examples. Every plant that becomes permanent in a garden is running one or more of 3 underground accounts. The first is the seed vault. That is dormant seed sitting in your soil, sometimes for years, waiting on light and warmth and a little disturbance. You cannot dig a seed vault. You cannot pull a seed vault. There is no spade on earth that removes it. The only tool that touches a seed vault is a pair of shears and a calendar, used before the seed hardens. That is why before fall matters so much for this first group. Once the seed ripens and drops, your window's shut, and nobody rang a bell. The second is the bud bank. This is the one almost nobody explains properly. A rhizome is not a root. A rhizome is a stem that happens to be lying down underground, and like every stem it carries dormant buds spaced along its length. A stolon is the same idea running across the surface instead of under it. So when you push a spade through a patch of rhizomes, you are not cutting roots, you are taking cuttings. You are doing propagation, in your own bed, for free, on the plant's behalf. Now, you have surely heard somebody say that every single fragment, no matter how small, will grow back. I understand the frustration behind that, but it is not quite true, and the difference matters enormously to you. A fragment regrows when it carries at least 1 live bud and enough stored energy to push that bud all the way up to daylight. Work published in the journal Weed Research in 2024 looked at precisely this question in couchgrass and found that the weight of the rhizome fragment and the number of buds drawing on it together determine whether it regrows and how strongly weight and buds. Not sorcery, which means a small enough, poor enough, exhausted enough fragment simply dies in the dark, and that is your opening. Which brings us to the third account, and this is the one that beats the other 2. The third is the sugar vault. Every rhizome, every thick root, every tuber and stolon and crown is packed with stored carbohydrate, and that stored sugar funds the entire operation. The seeds, the buds, the comeback, the spring flush, the recovery after you chopped it, all of it gets paid for out of that vault. And unlike the other 2 accounts, the sugar vault has a bottom. Better than that, the bottom shows up on a calendar in the same week every year, and you can be standing there waiting for it. That is the whole idea. 3 accounts. One of them can be starved. Everything I tell you for the next half hour is about learning to read which account a plant is running so you stop paying into it by accident. And let me tell you why you have not heard this before. There is no product in it. You cannot patent a date. You cannot pour a carbohydrate curve into a jug and put a barcode on the side of it. The single most effective technique in this entire video costs nothing and takes about 10 minutes every 10 days. That is exactly why it has never once been stacked on an end cap at your garden center. Around here we call that economic invisibility, and it is where most of the good stuff in gardening lives. So, account number 1, the seed vault. These first 6 are the plants where the title of this video is literally true. Rip them out before fall, or at the very minimum, get the flowers off them before fall, because with this group the flower is the invoice. Plant number 1. Sweet Autumn Clematis, Clematis terniflora. I will give it every bit of credit it deserves, because I planted one and I loved it for 2 years. Late August, early September, an established vine throws a cloud of small white flowers with a honey scent that carries across a whole yard on a warm evening. It is beautiful. It is not a trick. Here is the account it runs. Those flowers turn into seed heads, and each seed carries a silky feathered tail built for wind. Not a few seeds, a blizzard of them, drifting into your neighbor's yard, into the fence line, into whatever bit of wood's edge is downwind of you. It is now naturalized well beyond gardens across a wide stretch of the eastern United States. And here is the part that matters, and that nobody says. Cutting the vine down does almost nothing on its own, because you are attacking the wrong account. The vine is the branch office. The seed is the vault. What to do instead, and you can do this on any Saturday in the next 3 weeks. Shear the flowers off while they are still white and soft, before the seed heads go silvery and fluffy. That is the whole intervention. Bag them, do not toss them on the compost pile, because a cool backyard pile will not kill viable seed. If you want that same late-season white flower cloud on a plant that will not colonize the woods behind you, plant Virgin's Bower, Clematis virginiana. Native, same bloom window, feeds native bees and butterflies, and it seeds like a garden plant instead of a weather system. Plant number 2, Chinese silver grass, Miscanthus sinensis. This one is going to sting for some of you, and I am going to be straight about it, because I had 3 of them. Miscanthus is the ornamental grass that made ornamental grasses popular in this country. Tall, upright, gorgeous in October when the plumes catch low light, and it does not run. Its roots stay in a clump. And for about 30 years that was the entire story. And the entire story was true. What changed is the seed. Older cultivars were mostly poor seeders in most of the country. Newer ones, and warming falls that give seed more time to finish, have changed the math, and Miscanthus is now naturalizing along roadsides and field edges through the mid-Atlantic and parts of the Southeast. Its account is a pure seed vault, and it is running that account from a clump that looks perfectly innocent because it never spread an inch. That is the thing I want you to take from this one. Well-behaved roots tell you nothing about whether a plant is well-behaved. Those are 2 separate accounts. You do not have to rip it out. This is a case where the honest answer is more useful than the dramatic one. Cut the plumes off in late fall or early winter, before they shatter and blow, and you have closed the account. If you do not want that annual chore, replace it with switchgrass. Panicum virgatum. Native, upright, brilliant fall color, and there are name selections that give you the same architecture. Plant number 3, yellow flag iris, Iris pseudochorus. You find this one in the pond section, usually with a tag that says something friendly about wet feet and pollinators. Bright yellow flags in late spring, thriving where nothing else will stand. Its seed vault has a delivery system the others do not. The seed pods split and the seeds float. So a plant sitting quietly at the edge of your rain garden is not spreading across your yard. It is spreading downstream, into the ditch, into the creek, into whatever your water eventually joins. It is regulated as a noxious or prohibited plant in a growing number of states, and I would ask you to check your own state list rather than take my word for it. One safety note before you go touch it. The sap of this iris can irritate skin. Wear gloves. The honest instruction is simple. Deadhead it before the pods form and get it out of anywhere connected to moving water. For a wet spot with a yellow flower, look at marsh marigold in the north, or better, at blue flag iris. Iris versicolor, which is native across much of the east, handles the same standing water and stays where you put it. Plant number 4, purple loosestrife, Lythrum salicaria. Now I have to correct something, because this plant is the subject of the single most repeated piece of misinformation in the whole regret plant genre, and Golden Harvest does not pass along a claim just because it makes a better story. You will hear, constantly, that purple loosestrife is on the federal noxious weed list. It is not. The Fire Effects Information System, maintained by the United States Forest Service, lists its federal legal status as no special status. What is true, and what is frankly more useful to you, is that it has been listed as a noxious weed by roughly 29 states and 2 Canadian provinces. This is a state-level fight, which means your obligations depend entirely on where you live. And here is the detail that actually answers the question you are about to ask. Washington State does not just list it, it quarantines it. And that quarantine covers every Lythrum species, every hybrid cross, and every named cultivar. Every one. Which brings us to the sterile cultivar business. For years, Morden Pink and Morden Gleam and others were sold as the safe answer. Sterile, no seed, no problem. North Carolina State Extension now puts it plainly, that cultivars once believed not to be invasive are known to cross and produce strains that spread rapidly in the landscape. So the promise was not a lie exactly. It was a promise made about a plant standing alone, in a country where it no longer stands alone. The mechanism is the reason. Washington State University notes that spread from the roots is actually limited in this plant. It reproduces primarily by seed. That should be liberating news for you, because it means the crown is not the enemy. The flower spike is. Cut the spikes when they are in full color, and bag them. That is the whole battle for a garden clump. For the drama of a tall magenta spike in wet ground without any of this, plant Joe Pye weed or blue flag iris. Plant number 5, pampas grass, Cordaderia celowana. Everybody who has ever made a list like this puts pampas grass on it, and everybody says the same number, up to 1 million seeds a year. I want to give you the real one, because the real one is better. The Washington State Noxious Weed Control Board reports the estimated mean number of seeds counted from escaped pampas grass plants at about 416,000 per plant, with a documented range from around 54,000 to just over 840,000. The California Invasive Plant Council puts it at up to 100,000 seeds from a single plume. So not a million, closer to 500,000 in a normal year from one plant, which I think you will agree is quite enough. But here is the mechanism, and this is the part that has never made it into one of these videos. Why does it matter if I only have one? Because Cal IPC documents that the seeds develop without fertilization. No pollen, no mate. No second plant anywhere in the county. One lone pampas grass in the corner of a yard is a fully self-sufficient seed factory, and that single biological fact is why the dwarf cultivars and the supposedly safer selections have never solved anything. It was never about finding it a partner. A genuine safety word before you go anywhere near an established clump. The leaf margins carry sharp teeth that cut skin readily. Not scratch, cut. Thick leather gloves, sleeves down, forearms covered. Real tools. I do not care how many years you have been gardening. For that big architectural plume without the seed storm, big blue stem or switchgrass in the cultivar Dallas Blues will give you the height and the presence, and mully grass gives you that pink cloud in October that stops people on the sidewalk. Plant number 6, common blue violet, Viola sororia. This one is going to start an argument in my comments, and I want it to. Common blue violet is native across most of eastern North America, and its leaves are the host plant for several of our fritillary butterflies. That is real. That is not decoration, and I am not going to tell you to eliminate it. What I am going to tell you is how it beats you, because it is the cleanest teaching example of a seed vault I know. That violet is running two flower systems. The purple ones you see in April are the advertisement. Then, in summer, down at soil level, hidden under the leaves, it produces a second set of flowers that never open at all. They pollinate themselves in the dark and set seed without ever showing you a petal. That is called cleistogamy, and when those pods mature, they fling the seed away from the parent under spring tension. Read that again in your head. Its main seed production happens in flowers you have never seen, on a plant you thought you were watching. There is one more piece. The waxy surface of a violet leaf sheds standard broadleaf products, which is why the thing that cleans up dandelions leaves violets untouched, and people conclude the plant is indestructible. It is not indestructible. It is waterproof. My honest recommendation, and it is not the dramatic one, keep it. Give it a corner, a rough edge, the strip along the back fence, and let the fritillaries have it. Just do not let it hold ground you have designs on. And remember that pulling it in September gains you nothing at all, because the seed left 3 months ago while you were busy. Now we change accounts and we change verbs. Everything from here on is a bud bank plant, and for every single one of them, the instruction "rip it out before fall" is wrong. Not slightly wrong, backwards. If you take one thing from Golden Harvest today, take this next paragraph. A bud bank plant does not lose ground when you tear at it in autumn. It gains ground for two reasons. First, autumn is when the plant is pulling its sugars down into storage, so the vault is filling, not emptying, which means every fragment you leave behind is better funded in October than it was in May. Second, tearing at a rhizome mat is division. You are cutting it into pieces, and each viable piece is a new independent plant with its own buds and its own supply. You have taken one plant with one crown and handed yourself 9. So we are going to talk about starving these, not fighting them. Plant number 7, bishop's weed, also called goutweed, Agopodium podagraria. The variegated form is what you will meet, that pretty white-edged leaf, sold for exactly the situation most of us have, which is a dry shaded strip along a fence where grass has quit and hostas sulk. It runs a dense mat of white underground runners, and those runners are stem, not root, carrying buds along the whole length. That is the honest reason it seems to explode after you dig at it. One correction to the usual telling. You will hear it described as hardy from zone 3 to zone 9, and therefore able to conquer the whole country. It is genuinely brutal across the North and the Midwest and the Northeast. It struggles considerably in the hot, humid South. If you are in Georgia or Alabama, this is not the plant on this list that should worry you. The starvation approach works on this one better than almost anything else, and I will give you the full schedule in a few minutes. Plant number 8, chameleon plant, Houtoinia cordata. If I could reach through the screen and take one plant out of one shopping cart, it would be this one, and I am surprised how rarely it makes these lists. It is sold on its leaf, and the leaf is stunning, heart-shaped, splashed with cream and rose and green all at once, sitting in the pond section under a label about ground cover for damp places. It looks like a plant that could not possibly cause trouble. It runs deep, brittle, freely branching rhizomes, and the combination of deep and brittle is what should stop you. Brittle means every attempt to lift it snaps it. Deep means the pieces you snapped off are below the depth you were working at, in undisturbed soil, with all their buds intact. If you want it, and some people do want it, grow it in a pot standing on a hard surface, not sunk in the ground, standing on stone or concrete where you can see underneath it. Plant number 9, yellow archangel, Lemmiastrum galeobobdilon. Silver marbled leaves, yellow hooded flowers in spring, sold as the answer for dry shade, often as the cultivar Hermann's Pride, with the reassuring implication that the tidy one is the safe one. It runs stolons across the surface, rooting at every node it touches. It has escaped into forest understory in the Pacific Northwest seriously enough that Washington regulates it, and one of the main roots out of gardens is yard waste dumped at the edge of a woodlot. Please do not do that with anything on this list. Because its stolons run on the surface rather than deep, this is one of the more winnable ones. Lift the mat, then keep taking the regrowth on the schedule I am about to give you. Plant number 10. Gooseneck loosestrife, Lysomachia clethroides. Completely different plant from the purple loosestrife we discussed. No relation, no shared problem. And I want to clear that up because the shared name causes real confusion in comment sections every year. This one is beloved and it deserves to be. Arching white flower spikes in midsummer, each one curved over like the neck of a goose, wonderful cut, tough as boots. And it runs a shallow, fast, extremely well-funded rhizome mat that will cross an 8-foot border in a couple of seasons and go straight through the crowns of whatever is standing in the way. Here is the piece of advice that will save some of you a season. Because its rhizomes run shallow, this is one of the very few plants where a proper physical barrier actually works. Most of the time, barriers are a waste of money. For gooseneck, a solid edging sunk a good 10 inches, and standing an inch proud of the soil surface genuinely contains it, because it cannot go under and it will not climb over. Plant number 11. Periwinkle, Vinca minor. The most stalked ground cover in North America, and I understand exactly why. Evergreen, shade-tolerant, blue flowers in spring, essentially no maintenance once it takes. It spreads by above-ground stems that root wherever they meet moist soil, building a locked evergreen mat that nothing germinates through. Not wildflowers, not fern, not tree seedlings. In your own yard, with lawn around it and a spade to cut the edge twice a year, it genuinely reads as manageable, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. The problem is on the other side of your fence, in woodland understory across large parts of this country, and the roots out are drainage paths, fence lines, and birds moving fruit. The good news, mechanically, is that its buds are almost all on the surface. This is a bud bank you can see, which means smothering works on it, and smothering is free. Now the third group, and this is the one that catches experienced gardeners, because the plants in it do not look like spreaders at all. A rhizome is an underground stem, and stems are supposed to make buds, fine. But some plants form buds on their actual roots, adventitious buds, meaning buds arising where the textbook does not expect them, and root systems go further and deeper than any rhizome mat. Plant number 12, Japanese anemone, Areocapitella hupahensis, and you will still see it sold as anemone. I want to be honest that this is the plant on this list I like the most. Late summer into fall, when everything else in the border has given up, it puts out those clean pink or white cups on tall, wiry stems, and it is genuinely one of the great garden plants. And it runs a root bud bank. It sends lateral roots out through the bed and pushes new crowns up off those roots, several feet from the mother plant, right through the middle of things you care about. Then, when you decide to deal with it and you dig, you snap those roots, and every fragment carrying a bud starts a new colony. People describe this plant as multiplying after removal, and that is precisely what happened. I still grow it. I put it where it can run, at the back, against a mown edge, and a mown edge is the real containment, because every crown that comes up in turf gets taken off at ground level on a schedule. Do not put this in a small formal bed with plants you are attached to. Plant number 13, trumpet vine, Campsis radicans. And I have put this here deliberately because it lets me say something that the native plant conversation sometimes obscures. Trumpet vine is native. It is a genuinely important hummingbird plant, and it is one of the most aggressive things you can put next to a house. Native does not mean well-behaved. Those are two entirely unrelated facts, and I would rather you hear that from someone who plants natives on purpose. Behavior is about the plant's strategy, not its passport. Trumpet vine suckers from its roots, far from the parent, into lawns and beds and out through cracks. It is heavy, and it climbs by aerial rootlets that will get into siding, gutters, and mortar joints. The removal problem is that cutting the vine at the base tells the root system to activate the whole bud bank at once, and you get 20 suckers where you had one trunk. If you want hummingbirds without a structural conversation with your house, grow coral honeysuckle, Lonicera sempervirens. Native hummingbirds adore it, and it will not lift your gutters off. Plant number 14, horseradish, Armoracia rusticana. I am putting a vegetable on a perennial list on purpose, Because a lot of you have this, and none of you meant to keep it. You planted it once. You dug it once, and that is the moment it became permanent, because horseradish regenerates from root fragments, and harvesting is fragmentation. Every harvest is a planting. Somebody in your family put it in a corner of the vegetable garden 30 years ago, and it is still there, and it has moved. If you want horseradish, and it is a fine thing to want, grow it in a large container or a dedicated bed with hard edges that you have made peace with forever. Do not put it in a bed you plan to rotate. And notice what all three of these have in common. The moment of damage is the moment of propagation. That is the signature of a root bud bank, and once you can recognize that signature, you will spot it in plants I have not mentioned. Plant number 15, running bamboo, Philostachys. I saved this one because it is not simply a bigger version of the others. It is a different kind of account entirely, and understanding that is the difference between a season of work and a decade of it. Let me start with why people plant it, because the reason is good. Somebody wants privacy. That is a real want, and I am not going to mock it. Here is the account. A running bamboo grove is not a collection of plants. It is one organism. Those culms, the canes coming up out of the ground, are all connected by leptomorph rhizomes running laterally, and they share a single carbohydrate supply across the entire colony. Think about what that means because it changes everything. When you cut a culm, you have not starved anything. You have closed one branch office while the bank sits untouched. The colony simply pays for a replacement out of the shared vault, and it can pay for a great many replacements. This is why people describe cutting bamboo as pointless in a way that cutting other plants is not. It is not pointless because bamboo is magic. It is pointless because you are cutting a withdrawal slip, not the account. It is also why bamboo is the one plant on this list where I will tell you plainly that a barrier is worth real money. A proper rhizome barrier, high-density polyethylene, 60 mils or heavier, set deep, sloped outward, and standing a couple of inches above the soil line so you can see and cut anything that tries to jump it. Installed before planting, or the day you decide to keep what you have. That is a contractor conversation, not a Saturday. And there is a part of this that is not horticultural at all. Bamboo crosses property lines underground, and a number of states and towns now have ordinances and liability rules about exactly that. Neighbors who liked each other for 20 years have ended up with attorneys because of a grove somebody planted for privacy. If you have running bamboo near a boundary, that is worth a friendly conversation this month rather than a formal one next year. If you want a fast privacy screen, look at what a mixed hedge of native shrubs does over 4 or 5 years. It gets you there slower, it feeds birds the whole time, and it never becomes something you have to disclose when you sell the house. If you want bamboo specifically, and some of you will, then choose a clumping type, the ones with pachymorph rhizomes, which genuinely stay in a clump because their rhizome architecture is different. That is not marketing. That is a real structural distinction, and it is the one place in this whole video where a cultivar choice actually solves the problem instead of pretending to. Alright, this is the part I would have paid money for 30 years ago, and it is free, and it is why I built this channel. There are 3 windows in a year when a bud bank plant is vulnerable. Miss them, and you can work all season and gain nothing. Hit them and plants that people call impossible become ordinary chores. Window 1. Spring emergence. This is the big one. Rutgers Cooperative Extension lays out the timing, and I want you to hear it in detail because the detail is the whole trick. A perennial comes up in spring on stored carbohydrate. Once those shoots break the surface, the plant keeps sending carbohydrate up from the roots for another 7 to 10 days while it builds a canopy of leaves. From about day 10 to day 14 is a transition period. And within roughly 14 days of emergence, it flips and starts sending carbohydrate from the leaves back down into the roots to refill. So there is a moment, about a week and a half after those shoots appear, when that plant has spent almost everything it had and has not yet earned any of it back. That is the bottom of the vault. Rutgers puts the principle in one sentence, that starvation of perennial weeds is accomplished by never allowing the weed to move carbohydrates back down into the roots. And the practical instruction is to cut or shallowly disturb every 7 to 10 days until it stops trying to come up. Every 7 to 10 days, not every 7 to 10 weeks, which is what most of us actually do. That is the entire difference, and it is worth saying out loud that a single missed cut hands the plant a full refill and much of your progress with it. 10 minutes with a pair of shears or a string trimmer on a schedule from the day it emerges. That is the technique. You could write it on an index card. Window 2. Bud to bloom. University of Maryland Extension notes that the lowest root carbohydrate reserves in Canada thistle occur just before flowering, at the stage they call bud to bloom, and that management time to deplete food reserves is what is most likely to prevent regrowth and spread. Different species sit at slightly different points, and you should treat this as a principle rather than a fixed date. But as a rule you can use, when you see flower buds forming and no flower open yet, that plant has just made its largest single expenditure of the year. Cut it then, and you take the leaves away at the exact moment it most needs them. This window also does double duty, because cutting at bud stage on a seed vault plant closes that account for the year at the same time. Window 3. Autumn, and the flow reverses. By late season, the direction of travel reverses, and sugars run downward into storage for winter. Two things follow from that. The first is the honest flip I promised you at the start. This is the worst possible time to rip at a bud bank plant, because you are fragmenting a system at its best funded moment. Every piece you leave has a full tank. The second is that this is when anything applied to the leaves travels down with the sugars rather than sitting at the top. So if you have decided to use a labeled product on a bad situation, autumn is when it does the most good for the least material. And I want to be very clear about this. Read the label, follow the label, and the label is the law. Talk to your county extension office before you treat anything near water, near a vegetable garden, or near a well, and let them tell you what is appropriate for your state and your site. The free autumn option, and the one I actually use, is smothering. Cut everything to the ground, lay overlapping cardboard with the tape pulled off, wet it thoroughly, put 4 to 6 inches of coarse mulch on top, and leave it alone for a full season. That does not fragment anything. It simply removes light, so every bud that fires spends stored sugar and finds no way to earn any back. It is the same starvation strategy as window 1, running slowly, without you having to show up every 10 days. And notice, please, that not one of these 3 windows requires you to buy anything. Before we finish, the part of every Golden Harvest video where I go back over the things that get repeated in this corner of the internet and tell you which ones do not hold up, including a couple I believed myself for years. Myth 1. Purple loosestrife is on the federal noxious weed list. It is not. The Forest Service lists its federal status as no special status. It is a state matter, in something like 29 states. Myth 2. Pampas grass makes 1 million seeds a year. The documented mean from escaped plants is closer to 416,000, in a range up to about 840,000. The real number is enormous. We do not need to round it up. Myth 3. The sterile cultivar is the safe version. For purple loosestrife, North Carolina State Extension says, cultivars once thought not to be invasive are known to cross and spread. For pampas grass, the point is bigger, because those seeds develop without fertilization at all, so sterility of a partner was never the issue. Be skeptical of any tag that solves an ecological problem with a trademark. Myth 4. Every fragment, however tiny, will grow back. Not so. And this one matters, because it is the belief that makes people quit. A fragment needs a live bud and enough stored energy to reach light. The weed research work in 2024 found fragment weight and bud number together govern regrowth. Small, poor, buried, shaded fragments die. That is the crack you work in. Myth 5. Landscape fabric will stop a running plant. It will not. Rhizomes travel above it in the mulch layer and below it through any seam. The exceptions are genuine solid barriers, sunk deep and standing proud, and that only pays for gooseneck loosestrife and for bamboo. Myth 6. Boiling water, vinegar, or salt will kill the roots. Household vinegar and boiling water are top kill. They burn what they touch, and the vault underneath is untouched. So what you have done is trigger a withdrawal and then leave. On a bud bank plant that is not neutral, it is a small deposit. And please do not put salt in garden soil. You will still have the plant, and you will now have a spot where nothing decent grows for years. Myth 7. Native means well-behaved. Trumpet vine is native. Common blue violet is native. Ostrich fern is native. Behavior is a strategy, not a passport, and the honest way to talk about native plants is to be as truthful about them as we are about anything else. That truthfulness is the reason to trust the recommendation when it comes. Myth 8, and this is mine, from my own beds. Dividing an aggressive perennial in autumn tidies it up. It does not. It multiplies it. At the moment its vault is fullest. I did that with an anemone for 3 years running, and genuinely could not work out why I kept getting more of it. So let me put the whole thing back together in the plainest words I have. You have not been losing to these plants because you are getting older. You have been losing because almost every removal method any of us was taught is a deposit into an account we could not see. 3 accounts. The seed vault, which the shears close, before fall, before the seed hardens. The bud bank, which digging only ever multiplies. And the sugar vault underneath both, which has a bottom about 10 days after emergence and again at bud to bloom, and which will fund a comeback from anything you tear at in October. And here is the piece I would like to leave with you, because it goes well past these 15 plants. Ask that question about everything in your garden, not just the troublemakers. What is this plant storing? Where is it storing it? And what am I doing that pays into it? That question is why we say, around here, feed the soil, not the plant. A garden is an economy running underground, and once you can read the flows in it, you stop guessing. Standard reminders, and I mean them. Every date in this video shifts with where you live. Confirm your USDA hardiness zone and call your county extension office because they know your county, your soil, and your state's regulated plant list better than any video ever will, and they will talk to you for free. If you use any product, read the label and follow it exactly. If you handle pampas grass, wear real leather gloves. If you handle yellow flag iris, wear gloves too. Now, 3 things from you, and the first one is the one I care about most. Tell me which account is beating you, not which plant, which account. Say seed vault, bud bank, or sugar vault, and name the plant, and I will read every one of those. Second, and I would like a real argument here. Plenty of experienced gardeners are going to tell me that the 10-day cutting schedule is unrealistic for a working person or for someone with a bad back, and that a labeled product once in autumn is the humane answer. That is a fair position, and I do not think it is wrong. Make that case in the comments. I would rather this channel have an honest disagreement in public than a comment section that only nods. And third, tell me what you inherited. So many of you bought a house with somebody else's decisions already in the ground. What came with your place, and what did it cost you to find out? That is the knowledge that actually helps the next person who lands on this video before they buy the plant. Your zone in the comments if you have not already. I am Golden Harvest. This is free, and it stays free, and I will see you out by the beds next time.